Hello, my name is Apple, and welcome to AppleKnows, where I tell you things so strange and real that you'll find yourself questioning everything you thought you knew about education. Let's begin with a fact that might shock you. In North Korea, schools are required to teach children a subject called Kim Jong-il's revolutionary history, and textbooks include not just science or math, but stories of the leaders' lives written as if they were legends. For many students, this isn't just education, it's indoctrination. Compare that with Finland, where children don't even start formal school until the age of 7, yet their education system is considered one of the best in the world. No standardized testing, no heavy homework, and still they outperform many nations. It flips everything you thought about early education upside down. Now let me tell you something truly unsettling. In ancient Sparta, education was so brutal that children were taken from their families at the age of 7 to live in military barracks. Their lessons were not about reading or writing but about endurance, pain, and survival. They were forced to steal food to learn cunning, and if they got caught, the punishment wasn't for stealing but for failing to do it skillfully. Education there was literally a training ground for warriors. But fast forward to the 19th century in England, and you'll see children as young as 4 working in factories instead of attending schools, because education was considered less urgent than labor. What we now take for granted as a right was once a privilege, and even today, over 250 million children globally still lack access to proper schooling. Here's one that makes you pause. In Bhutan, a small Himalayan country, schools teach something no Western system dares to touch: happiness. Instead of pushing endless exams, they integrate emotional well-being into the curriculum, measuring the nation's success not by GDP but by gross national happiness. Students learn mindfulness, compassion, and cultural values alongside math and science. Imagine if your report card didn't just tell you about algebra but also about your emotional health. Strange, right? But it works. Now think about this. In Japan, until the 4th grade, children are not even graded on academic performance. Instead, they are evaluated on manners, empathy, and respect. The first years of school are not about filling your head with facts but about shaping your character. Meanwhile, in the United States, school cafeterias once banned soda machines because of health concerns, but in France, children are served 4-course meals during school lunches that would rival a restaurant. Education there isn't just about the mind but also about teaching children the culture of food and community. And here's a darker twist. In Victorian-era England, teachers used canes and whips as common classroom tools. Corporal punishment was considered a normal part of education, and some students were scarred for life. But even more surprising is that in certain parts of the United States, corporal punishment in schools is still legal today. Imagine living in a country that puts rockets on Mars, yet still allows children to be paddled in classrooms. One of the strangest facts comes from Germany, where homeschooling is actually illegal. Parents who try to keep their children out of school can face fines or even jail time. The government believes education must be standardized for all, while in the US, homeschooling is perfectly legal and practiced by millions. The contrast couldn't be sharper. And then there's this. In the past, Irish hedge schools were literally held in fields and behind bushes during the 18th and 19th centuries, because Catholics were banned from receiving formal education under British rule. Teachers would secretly gather children outdoors to pass on knowledge, risking punishment. Imagine learning your alphabet while hiding behind a hedge, always afraid someone might report you. You might think education is only about knowledge, but here's a chilling fact. During the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, education was almost destroyed. Intellectuals, teachers, even people who wore glasses were targeted, because glasses were seen as a sign of being educated. Schools were turned into prisons, and learning itself became a crime. That's how fragile education can be when power fears knowledge. And finally, here's something you didn't see coming. In 2010, China introduced classes in certain provinces where students were taught the art of nap-taking. Yes, naps. Students were trained in how to take effective midday rest as part of their academic routine, because research showed short naps improved memory and performance. What some cultures call laziness, others call science. So when you think you know what education means, remember this. It can be about happiness in Bhutan, survival in Sparta, silence in North Korea, or even secret lessons behind hedges in Ireland. It can be a privilege, a punishment, or a weapon. And every single fact is real. Did you know that in France during the 19th century, children were actually punished for speaking their native regional languages like Breton or Occitan in school? The government wanted to enforce French as the only language, so kids were humiliated, fined, or even beaten for using the tongue they learned at home. Education wasn't just about knowledge, it was about control. And here's one that flips your view of discipline upside down. In Thailand, it was once common for teachers to shave students' heads as punishment for bad behavior. Imagine walking around with a patch of hair missing, not because you wanted a haircut but because your teacher thought shame was the best lesson. In contrast, schools in Denmark often allow students to call teachers by their first names, breaking down hierarchy to build respect on a personal level rather than fear. Another unbelievable fact is about school calendars. In the United States, the long summer vacation many students love was never meant to give kids a break. It actually came from the 19th century belief that children needed time away from cities during the hot season to escape disease and heat. Meanwhile, in Japan and South Korea, students get much shorter summer breaks, around 6 weeks, yet they often attend extra cram schools in the evenings. Education there doesn't stop when the bell rings. But here's something almost eerie. In India, some village schools have been experimenting with classrooms run almost entirely by computers. The children are given screens and software, and research shows they often teach themselves faster than when guided by undertrained teachers. In one famous case, a computer was placed in a wall in a poor neighborhood, and within weeks, kids with no prior knowledge taught themselves how to browse, use applications, and even speak English. It raises a question: how much of education depends on teachers, and how much comes from curiosity? Let me take you further back in time. In medieval Europe, universities like Oxford and Paris were not the quiet halls of learning you might picture. Students often formed violent gangs, clashed with townspeople, and even rioted over food prices or teaching disputes. In some cases, the universities had their own legal systems, protecting students from local law. Education was literally its own world, complete with rebellion and chaos. And then there's this: in South Korea, high school students often study for more than 12 hours a day. The pressure is so intense that final exams are treated like national events. On test days, airplanes are grounded and construction is paused near testing centers to make sure there's no noise to distract students. Imagine an entire country adjusting its routine because of a school exam. One of the strangest facts comes from ancient China. The imperial examination system, which lasted for over 1,000 years, required candidates to memorize and recite Confucian classics word for word. The exams could last several days, and students were locked in tiny cubicles with just a desk, food, and a chamber pot. Some even died during the process, but success meant social status and a government career. Education was literally a matter of life or death. And speaking of danger, in some parts of the world today, children risk their lives just to get to school. In remote areas of Indonesia, kids cross shaky rope bridges hanging over rivers. In Colombia, some ride zip lines hundreds of meters above valleys. What many take for granted as a short bus ride can be an extreme survival challenge elsewhere. So education has been a battlefield, a prison, a playground, and sometimes a death trap. Yet people keep seeking it, no matter how bizarre or dangerous the conditions. Let's dive even deeper into the strangest truths about education. You've heard of school uniforms, but here's a twist. In Bhutan and some parts of Japan, students are required to wear national dress at school, not just a uniform. It's seen as a way to connect students to cultural identity. Meanwhile, in England during the Victorian era, school uniforms were introduced not for tradition but to enforce discipline and reduce individuality. Clothing has always been part of the lesson, even when no one says it out loud. Now think about this. In Ethiopia, children are taught in more than 80 different local languages, depending on the region. But in many African countries during colonial times, local languages were banned in schools, replaced with French, English, or Portuguese. The classroom wasn't just a place of learning, it was a tool for erasing identity. And even today, millions of children are forced to learn in a language that isn't their own. Here's one that feels surreal. In Italy during the Renaissance, classrooms were sometimes held inside churches, and priests would teach lessons surrounded by religious art. Students literally studied under the eyes of painted saints and angels. Contrast that with modern-day Silicon Valley schools, where many tech leaders, like those at Apple and Google, send their kids to schools with little or no technology. Yes, you heard that right. The people who create the most advanced devices often choose education that avoids screens, preferring hands-on learning with books and crafts. Let's go to Russia for a bizarre example. During the Soviet era, schools required students to learn not just math and literature, but also how to take apart and reassemble rifles. Military training was part of everyday education. Even today, some countries include compulsory drills and defense lessons in school routines. While some children learn art, others are taught how to march. And here's something that sounds almost unbelievable. In Kenya, in certain rural areas, some schools operate outdoors under trees. Desks and blackboards are carried outside each morning, and classes happen in the open air. It's not because it's a trendy idea, it's because there are no proper buildings. Education adapts to whatever environment it can find, proving that a classroom doesn't need walls. But let's move to one of the most shocking examples of inequality. In Brazil, there are schools located inside prisons, where inmates can reduce their sentences by attending classes and passing exams. Education there is literally freedom. Meanwhile, in some wealthy nations, education is treated as a competition rather than a right, with students paying massive fees just for the chance to learn. Here's another twist. In Finland, teachers are among the most respected and highly trained professionals in society, requiring master's degrees before they can even enter the classroom. In stark contrast, in some countries teachers are underpaid, undertrained, and sometimes barely a step ahead of the students they teach. The quality of education often depends not on students' ability, but on how society treats its teachers. And finally, let me leave you with this disturbing fact. In the United States during the 20th century, some Native American children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to erase their culture. They were forbidden to speak their languages, wear traditional clothes, or practice their customs. The motto was chilling: kill the Indian, save the man. Education became a weapon of assimilation, a tool to wipe out entire identities. So from cultural dress codes to outdoor classrooms, from prison schools to forced assimilation, the truth is clear: education is never neutral. It reflects power, history, and the strange ways humanity has tried to shape the next generation. Imagine this: in Japan, students clean their own classrooms and even toilets every day. The idea is that by taking care of their environment, they learn respect, responsibility, and teamwork. No janitors, just kids with brooms and buckets. Compare that with some countries where students throw trash on the floor without a second thought. Now here's a darker piece of history. In the United States during the early 20th century, some schools used IQ tests not only to measure ability but also to segregate children by race and social class. These tests were misused to label some students as less intelligent, creating lifelong barriers. Education became a gatekeeper, locking some doors instead of opening them. But not all strange facts are dark. In Colombia, there's a floating school built on stilts in the middle of the Amazon River. Children arrive by canoe, and lessons happen while the water flows underneath. The entire school moves with the rhythm of nature. Imagine math class while fish swim below your feet. And then there's South Korea again, where education is so competitive that private cram schools, called hagwons, stay open until midnight. Some children study for 16 hours a day, fueled by pressure from society and parents. The government even had to enforce a curfew to shut these schools down at 10 p.m., but many secretly kept going. Sleep becomes a luxury, sacrificed at the altar of academic success. Here's a fact that might make you smile. In Brazil's Amazon region, some schools schedule classes according to the rainy season. If heavy rain makes rivers impossible to cross, schools pause and restart when travel is safe again. Education there bends to the laws of nature instead of fighting them. But let's rewind to ancient Egypt. Education was reserved for the elite, mostly for boys who were trained to become scribes. They learned to write on pieces of broken pottery or flakes of limestone before ever touching papyrus. The ability to read and write was so rare that scribes held enormous power, often more respected than warriors. Knowledge was their weapon. Another strange fact comes from the Netherlands. Dutch children are considered among the happiest in the world, and part of the reason is their schooling system. Homework is kept minimal in primary grades, and children are given lots of time to play. While in other countries kids drag heavy backpacks and stress about grades, Dutch kids ride their bikes home carefree. And here's something surreal. In Turkey, there are schools built underground in cave systems of Cappadocia, where lessons continue in cool stone rooms carved centuries ago. In a way, the rock walls themselves have been classrooms for generations. But let's not forget how twisted education can get under oppressive regimes. In Nazi Germany, schools rewrote history and science to serve ideology. Math problems included counting tanks and calculating bomb loads, and biology lessons were poisoned with racist propaganda. Education was weaponized to shape obedient citizens instead of curious thinkers. And then there's this unexpected fact: in Mexico City, there's a school inside a subway station. While trains rush past, children sit in classrooms built underground, learning in the same space where thousands of commuters pass by daily. Education there literally runs alongside the pulse of the city. So whether it's underground caves, floating rivers, subway stations, or midnight classrooms, education adapts to every corner of the world, and sometimes, it becomes stranger than fiction. In South Sudan, some schools don't have textbooks, so teachers draw entire lessons on the ground with sticks. Math problems, grammar rules, even maps are scratched into the dirt. By the end of the day, the classroom is gone with a single rainstorm or gust of wind. Knowledge there is as fragile as the soil beneath their feet. Now let's step into Switzerland. In certain schools, students learn skiing as part of the curriculum. Yes, skiing. Physical education there isn't just running laps but connecting with the mountains that surround them. Compare that with Mongolia, where students might practice horseback riding as part of traditional lessons. Education reflects geography in ways you'd never imagine. Here's one that feels like science fiction. In Estonia, one of the most digitally advanced countries, children start coding classes as early as 7 years old. By the time they're teenagers, many already know how to program apps or websites. While in some nations kids still struggle with chalkboards, in Estonia they're shaping the digital future before they even hit high school. And then there's the story of Poland under communist rule. In the 1980s, underground flying universities were created, where professors secretly taught banned subjects like philosophy, history, and politics. Classes were held in apartments, basements, and even churches. Attending these lessons meant risking arrest, but for many, forbidden knowledge was worth the danger. One of the most surreal examples comes from Mexico, where in rural areas teachers sometimes travel on donkeys to reach remote mountain schools. It can take them hours to climb narrow, rocky paths, all just to teach a handful of children. Education there isn't just a profession, it's a physical journey. But let's get darker. In Victorian England, poor children sometimes attended ragged schools, named because students came in tattered clothes. These schools were often overcrowded, dirty, and harsh, yet they were the only chance for many to learn even the basics of reading. Imagine trying to focus on arithmetic while shivering in a freezing room with no shoes. Another fact that bends your mind comes from Australia. In the outback, where distances are massive, children once attended school through two-way radios. Lessons were broadcast over radio waves, and students would respond through microphones from cattle stations miles apart. Today, it has evolved into online school of the air, where kids living hundreds of kilometers away connect in virtual classrooms. Isolation never stopped learning, it just changed the medium. Now think about this. In Nigeria, there are floating schools built on wooden stilts in the Lagos Lagoon, designed to rise and fall with the water. Education there literally floats on instability, yet it continues despite floods and storms. And here's something shocking from the United States. In some rural areas during the Great Depression, children were forced to bring firewood to school as part of their daily responsibility. Without it, there would be no heat, and classes would freeze in the winter. Learning didn't just depend on teachers or books, it depended on whether kids could keep the stove burning. Finally, here's a fact that almost feels unreal. In Italy's Reggio Emilia schools, children are seen as co-creators of knowledge. They learn through art, play, and projects, with teachers acting more like guides than authorities. Walls are covered with children's drawings, and every question becomes an investigation. To many outsiders, it looks less like a classroom and more like a creative workshop. So from dirt floor classrooms to underground resistance universities, from skiing lessons to floating schools, education keeps revealing itself as stranger, harsher, and more inventive than you could ever expect. This is Apple from AppleKnows, and now we've reached the end of our journey through the strangest, darkest, and most surprising truths about education. From classrooms hidden in caves to lessons broadcast over the air, from schools that taught survival or happiness to those that erased culture or enforced obedience, one thing becomes clear: education is never just about books and exams. It is power, it is freedom, it is identity, and sometimes it is even survival. The way we teach and the way we learn tells the story of who we are as societies and what we value most. So next time you step into a classroom, remember, behind those walls is a history filled with rebellion, resilience, and some of the strangest realities you could ever imagine. And that's why at AppleKnows, we never stop digging, because the truth of education is far more fascinating than fiction.